What's going on, YouTube? We're back with another video today. Today's one I've had in the works for a little while now, and that's on dual grit sharpening. Seems to be a somewhat hot topic right now in the EDC community. We got a couple tests today to run through, so let's go ahead and get started. Dual grit sharpening seems to have gotten some traction in the EDC world lately, kind of showcased by knives sent in from the Home Slice over to Cedric and Ada. There have been a few tested at the time of recording this video with some pretty incredible results and then some that did not so well. So if you guys want to see more on that, head on over to Pete's channel and check that out. I want to do some of the testing myself to see how much this affected edge retention in my testing, since my testing is a little bit different than Pete's. I did some research prior to testing. Science of Sharp did an awesome article with some SEM imaging showing that dual grit sharpening produces just like a really big burr. The coarse stone forms a large burr, and then the fine stone kind of pushes it back to the center of the edge. Since it isn't being bent back and forth like normal sharpening, because in normal sharpening you're flipping a burr to this side, flipping a burr back to the other side. On dual grit sharpening, you're basically sending a burr to one side, and then the fine stone kind of pushes it back to the center. Since you're doing that, the burr is still pretty strong and undamaged, which kind of results in no folding or tearing of the burr in use. Super Steel Steve also did a great video on Instagram on it, kind of showing a different perspective. Supposedly they aren't really anything new. It's used in the kitchen cutlery world pretty often. They normally use like natural stones in that industry, which don't have a uniform grit like synthetic stones do. There's some bigger particles, some smaller particles, and those kind of result in a finer edge, but it has bite because of the irregular scratch pattern formed by those varying grit particle sizes. The kitchen side began using dual grit sharpening with synthetic stones to try and replicate the results that they get off of natural stones. I'm not too keen on natural stones. I don't know as much as someone like Steve does, but the synthetic stones probably wear a little bit slower, so that's kind of why they're doing that, and the grit's a little bit more uniform, gonna cut a little bit more consistently. So that leads us to the testing, and there's a few different tests that I did with a few different edge types to kind of see how they compare. So the knife being tested is the one I have right here in my hands, Benchmade Presidio 2 in S30V. Had this knife for a while, well over a year, and this knife has been used and sharpened as much or more than any of the other knives in my collection. Just a great little knife to use, small enough, but big enough to be able to put it through some use. Very comfortable, decent steel. I mean, it's S30V. It's absolutely good to go. Just a great little user knife, and I figured it'd be kind of a good knife to test for this, since it's a steel that probably everybody has. So the first edge I tested was my standard sharpening progression, 200 to 1000 grit plated diamond at 18 degrees per side, and that's followed up by 16 and 4 micron CBN on leather. So that edge came up really nice, no issues deburring it, and went ahead and got into testing after that. So for those of you who aren't totally aware, and this might be the first video you've seen of me doing some testing, I cut cardboard until the edge will no longer cut computer paper cleanly. If there's any sort of hang up in the edge, that's when I call the test. So the result on that initial edge was 265 feet. That's my normal sharpening progression, so this is our control test. 265 feet is the result that we're looking to be better than. Anything outside of 10% difference of this would be a notable change. So taking a look at the pre and post test microscope images, you can see that a few small microchips formed in the edge. You can also see how deep the scratches are even when finished with a 1000 grit stone, since those particles on an electroplated diamond stone are just basically thrown right on top of a steel plate. The next edge was the dual grit edge, a 200 grit finish on one side and a 1000 grit finish on the other, both plated diamond, followed by 16 and 4 micron CBN on leather. This was the edge that you guys saw on my Instagram post talking about dual grit edges. So that edge kind of had a pretty unique feel. Seemed refined with a lot of bite still. A little bit more difficult to deburr, since that 200 grit stone is so aggressive and takes off so much material in just one pass. Even though I say it has a unique feel, it feels kind of similar to like what a mid grit edge would feel like a 600 grit edge. How it's still It's refined, but it still has some bite to it. It feels pretty similar to that. The result after testing that edge was 275 feet, which is an increase of 3.77% over that control test. So that is not enough to be notable. Looking at the images now, the 1000 grit side is much more jagged than before the test, and the 200 grit side is mostly untouched. Just kind of interesting to see. I was actually going to stop here, and then Steve brought up the question in his video whether a dual grit edge would perform the same as one that's finished with the coarsest grit used. So that's what the third edge is. It's a 200 grit diamond edge only, plated diamond, no stropping. And I just gotta say, this was an absolute pain in the ass to deburr. That 200 grit diamond plate is super aggressive and removes so much material even on a light pass. That like the passes that I'm making to deburr it were like literally that long, like just tiny little passes. It took a very long time to make sure this was completely deburred. The edge that I was left with though was super nasty and very toothy. Just kind of a really good feel. It's something that you would want for cardboard. Just absolutely just rips into it and tears it apart. And the result off of that one was 310.33 feet, which is an increase of 17.1% over the control test and 12.85% over the dual grit edge. It's kind of an interesting result, and it had an interesting feel in testing. It started off super coarse and felt like it got finer about halfway through and then kind of dulled after that. That feeling's backed up by the microscope images. Let me know what you guys think, but it looks to me like the apex got finer and more uniform after the test. The last test here is with a 240 grit and 1200 grit Veneve bonded diamond edge with no stropping. The diamond particles on these stones are embedded in resin rather than plated on top like the plated stones are. We'll take a look at the stones here. This is the bonded diamond stone. I don't know how well you guys are going to be able to see this, but it's got diamond particles embedded in it. You can kind of see some of the shiny spots. So those particles are just sticking up enough to just barely be on the surface, and you're just kind of getting the edges of the particles to touch the edge. Whereas on a plated stone, it's basically just a bunch of 200 grit particles laid over top of this steel plate. So it's a much finer edge finish, more uniform. The scratches aren't quite as deep. Those Veneve stones also use a different grit scale than the plated stones, so that edge finish is more comparable to a 325 and 1000 grit plated stone. And the edge that came up off of those stones was super sticky, something that the other edges did not have other than the control test, and this was a much more refined version of that. Super easy to deburr since those particles in the stone aren't crazy large and aggressive like the plated stuff is. So really was no need for strops anyhow. The result off of that test was 245.33 feet, which is a 7.42% decrease from the control. I'm not really sure why it went down, but looking at the microscope images, a few microchips formed in testing, and there looks to be some irregularities in the apex before testing that got larger after the test. With all the results there, let's kind of get into my final thoughts on this. Do I think dual grit edges are worth it on an EDC knife? Based on these results, no. It can be tricky to deburr it, which is kind of an issue for someone who doesn't have a lot of sharpening experience, and there just isn't enough of a performance increase to justify it, in my opinion. It's also interesting to see how these results differ from Pete's. I kind of wonder if the test media makes a difference in these edges and how they'd hold up in daily use, since that involves cutting so many different materials throughout the day. One other thing I'd like to note is that depending on how you sharpen, it can be a massive pain in the ass to do this. On the wicked edge, it's not too bad since you have two stones, one on the left, one on the right, and you can kind of, you can use, your left stone can be your 1000 grit, your right stone can be your 200 grit. That makes it pretty easy. But if you use anything like a KME, a Hapstone, any of those type of systems that you're just using one stone, when you get down to the deburring passes, you're basically just switching out the stone every pass, which is really annoying. Freehand probably wouldn't be too bad either, since you could basically have both stones right next to each other. Just kind of something to keep in mind. I just know that it took me forever to get through the process when I was using the bonded stones on the Hapstone. Just super annoying to have to change out the stone every pass. Try this one out for yourselves, guys. Kind of see how it feels. Don't take my word for it. Test it yourself. See how your results turn out, and let me know down in the comments. This is just one set of tests using one knife and one steel. There's a lot of different variations that you could do. Different steels, different knives, all that sort of stuff, and the results may vary based on that. So if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like down below and subscribe to continue to see videos just like this one. As always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.